Good morning on this Sunday. You're listening to KJOY 98.3 with Tommy Shevlin and Police Talk. I am Nassau County PBA President, and I'm so happy to be here today and joined by fellow police officer, retired detective from NYPD, Dr. Tom Coughlan. Good morning, Tom.
Good morning, Tom. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate being here.
Today we're going to be talking about a very important topic, especially to me, going to be about mental health within the law enforcement community and first responder workplace. So I'm joined with Tom, who's a police psychologist, but before that, he was a police officer and detective himself. Tom, why don't you start off by just giving us your experience, please?
Sure, Tom. Thanks very much. So I joined the NYPD in 1997. I had come from another police agency before that. And while I was on the NYPD, I went back from my first master's in forensic psychology and then later went back for my doctorate in clinical psychology. And while I was on the NYPD, I was in the 108 precinct in Queens. I was in the 20, the 2 slow on the Upper West Side. And from there, I was downtown for a bit at the Puzzle Palace down at 1PP. And then from there, I did a little bit of time at the outdoor range and then went on to the medical division where I worked in psych services for the last 8 years of my career. Did 21 years, retired in late 2018. Opened up my private practice in Great Neck in 2019. And I've been operating a private practice since 2019 where I exclusively treat law enforcement and psychotherapy. I do a little bit of other assessment work on the side, but really the vast majority of my work is psychotherapy with law enforcement, first responders, public safety personnel.
Well, thank you for doing that. So we probably crossed paths because, as you know, I started my career with NYPD in 1998, and in 2005, I made the switch to Nassau County Police Department, where I still am, and now I am the Nassau County PBA President. Prior to becoming the Nassau PBA President, I was a counselor over at Employee Assistance for Nassau County Police Department. So that's why this is a near and dear topic to my heart, and that's where I had the chance to first meet Dr. Tom Coughlan. So, Tom, let's get right into it. Why were you interested in going into this field?
So before I came on the job, my undergrad was in psychology. And really, I graduated and really didn't know what I wanted to do in the field. Wasn't certain I really wanted to be in psychology at all. When I went back for my master's in forensic psych, it sort of breathed some fresh life into that. And initially what I wanted to do was really work in criminal psychology, doing assessments of offenders, sanity assessments, dangerousness assessments, things of that nature. When I had the opportunity, though, when I graduated in 2010 and had the opportunity to work in psych services on the department, it really opened up my eyes to the lack of good, competent mental health services for law enforcement that's out there. It opened up my eyes to the ways that law enforcement are sometimes treated internally in the department in regard to mental health needs. And I saw that there was a real need to destigmatize mental health in law enforcement and to get cops, and not just cops, but troopers and sheriffs and agents and everybody out there working in the law enforcement realm to get them good, competent mental health services. And really, some of the experiences I saw internally in the department where I saw that real void of truly competent pro-police services, and that really kind of changed my direction away from doing criminal psychology work and into police and public safety psychology.
Absolutely, and the stigma, that's pretty much what brought me into this. My big slogan is break the stigma, and the way that police officers are treated when they do suffer with mental illness, mental health issues, a lot of us feel that we're treated like we did something wrong, and we're treated almost the same as somebody would be treated when being disciplined. So I saw that there was a big void, big need to not just break the stigma and get police officers to get the help they need, but I also saw a big need and void within the police department, that they needed to change the way that they viewed mental health and took things a different way. In my opinion, a lot of police departments in the United States were stuck in the old days, and they really needed to come to 2022 at this point when it comes to mental health. It's not just a stigma in military and first responder community. Also, as we know, mental health is a huge issue in general life with our friends, family, the communities. It's with opiates and substance abuse. There's a lot of issues out there, and in school districts, and no matter what profession you're in, we need to break the stigma together across the board, in my opinion. And it definitely starts within within the police department. So one of the reasons why I got into this was because I myself suffered with my mental health. Years back, I had an addiction which was alcohol. I'm an alcoholic in recovery, coming up on 9 years now. And I know what it's like to struggle with on-the-job issues, with trauma, and not having the resources or the support to get the help that you need. I was fortunate enough that the job allowed me to do what I had to do personally and not just come back, but they actually welcomed me with open arms and allowed me to tell my story in order to help others. So that's kind of why I got into this. I realized that cops need help, and there's nobody out there that was willing to do it. So if I could tell my story every day to help people, that's exactly what I will do. And we need more doctors like you that you don't just have the book smarts and the degree. You have the knowledge because you lived it yourself. So I really thank you for everything you do on a daily basis. And I think there's a lot we can do together and really help break the stigma and change the way mental health is dealt with. And not just mental health, it's wellness. That's a big word, wellness. That's what we're all talking about now. Let me start off by asking you this. Do you believe that the job changes you?
Absolutely 100%. Law enforcement will change you. And, my goal when working with many of my clients is for them to return to that person who put up their right hand and swore their oath when they came on the job, to return to being that healthy person that they were when they came on the job. Law enforcement absolutely changes you. Truthfully, it changes you for the better in certain ways, but it can change you for the worse in other ways as well.
Can you explain that?
Sure. I mean, if we think about the stresses that go on in police work, if we lump them into three big buckets, there's the organizational stress, which is the stress that comes from the agency itself, right? Now, I think when people who are not inside law enforcement look into law enforcement, they don't understand that the majority of the stress in police work comes from the organization, comes from the agency, dealing with draconian policies, dealing with the mixed messages that come down from above, all of those things that come, the punitive policies that come basically everywhere. That's where the real stress in police work exists, and that has a real impact to you over time. The organizational betrayal that occurs in law enforcement, the moral injury that occurs from time to time. We have the occupational stress work, that kind of cost of doing business in law enforcement, working hours that nobody else works, having days off that nobody else has, missing family time, all those kind of stresses that come along.
Absolutely.
Mandatory overtime, et cetera. And then we have the operational stress, the stress that actually comes from responding to 911 jobs and doing our work out there, the trauma and the vicarious trauma that comes along with that. All of those things inherently over time, they lead to burnout. They lead to compassion fatigue. They can lead to post-traumatic response, post-traumatic reaction, a number of clinical consequences that can come out of law enforcement. But aside from the clinical consequences, law enforcement inherently changes you as a person over time, tends to kind of exacerbate the natural negativity bias that we all have to find the worst in any given situation because we have to as a survival mechanism. Really does tend to make us a little more cynical, a little more pessimistic than others.
And we tend to lose trust in people. That's one of the big things that I realized that happened to me and a lot of my clients when I was a counselor. It's tough because people don't realize most of the time people do not call 911 for good things. Mm-hmm. They don't call 911 to tell us that they're the proud parent or proud grandparent, right? Or their child just made the honor roll. All the good things that we celebrate. They call in the worst times of their life, the worst moments in their life, and that's the snapshot of what we witness as police officers on a daily basis. So it tends to build up where you're dealing with negativity over and over and over again. And after years on the job, it definitely changes you, and you do become cynical, like you just said, and you lose trust in people because you're out there, you have a front row seat, to pretty much all of the negative evil that the world has to offer.
it's interesting. There's a parallel, and I mean, as a mental health professional yourself, there's a parallel even in therapy, right? Nobody comes to my office and says, "Doc, everything's going great in my life. My life is perfect. I don't have a single problem. I just came to your office today to tell you how great my life is going." Right. Nobody does that, right? So everybody coming through my front door is bringing in some kind of trauma, bringing in some kind of life difficulty. And in the same way, even doing therapy work changes you over time differently. But doing police psychology, police therapy, it has its own sort of subtle nuances, right? Because everyone coming into my office is bringing me the worst of everything that's the worst that they've seen out in the street and during their career.
What's the difference between burnout and PTSD?
So in burnout, what we see is we see three primary factors in burnout. After an extended period of time of being asked to do more with less, after an extended period of time of feeling a low sense of reciprocity from your organization, or a low sense of reciprocity from the community, or a low sense of fulfillment and job satisfaction. In burnout, what we see is this detachment from the job. Right? This point in time where you become apathetic to your job, right? You no longer feel a sense of attachment or a sense of responsibility to your job tasks. If you make it to work, great. If you don't make it to work, great. If you sign in for 8 hours and do nothing and go home, then that's fine too, right? You become apathetic to your job responsibilities. You become detached from your job responsibilities. You develop a sense of cynicism, pessimism. You develop a low sense of reciprocity. You feel like either your job is not giving back to you the same degree of effort and energy you're giving it, or the community is not putting in you the same effort and energy that you're putting in the community and in the job you serve. Post-traumatic stress disorder is a bit different, right? In post-traumatic stress disorder, it's either the results of cumulative traumas over time, many traumatic critical incidents over time, or one particular single traumatic incident that was very, very significant. And what we see following a critical incident, if we see post-traumatic stress disorder, what we see are these four very large symptom buckets. One being changes in thoughts or mood, development of maybe survivor's guilt, heightened irritability, emotional numbing, kind of feeling like I don't have any emotions whatsoever at all. I'm just sort of numb. A sense of hypervigilance or hyperarousal, feeling like you're always on edge, like you're always in the traumatic moment. And changes in lifestyle where you start to avoid things that remind you of the traumatic incident, right? So, for example, I worked with an officer some time back who had been involved in removing a child from a car wreck. And it really became an issue for him that he never wanted to be anywhere around the smell of burning meat anymore. Right, so he wouldn't go to barbecues anymore. He wouldn't he wouldn't cook meat anymore because it all took him back to that moment. Right, so we see all of these thoughts about being locked back in the traumatic moment. So in burnout, what we really see is sort of a gradual progression toward just becoming apathetic to your job, not really caring anymore, and in post-traumatic stress disorder, we see these clinical symptom responses to a traumatic event.
I think there's a big misconception with PTSD that it has to be one event, like a 9/11, something like that.
Yeah, that is one of the big misconceptions. And what we know is that complex trauma, cumulative trauma over time, many traumatic events over a long period of time, is actually much more difficult to treat. It's much more set in like concrete over time. Single incident trauma has a better prognosis. We can more effectively treat it, right? Complex trauma, multiple traumatic incidents over a long period of time, more difficult to treat. And trauma reactivates trauma, right? So you may have a traumatic incident or critical incident today, but it's reactivating all those trauma events that were never processed in the past.
So I know on my job and a lot of the police departments, they have peer support. And this is something that peer support tries to help with whenever there's a critical incident. Could you just explain why that couldn't be helpful, useful to a police officer to just sit around and almost normalize an abnormal event that they just witnessed?
Yeah, so peer support is a great tool, one of the great tools in sort of an overall comprehensive wellness strategy that departments should be putting together. Peer support is where you have a trained peer at your workplace who's trained to intervene when there's a critical incident or when there's some kind of an off-duty, stressful situation going on. Following a critical incident, often there is a tendency to sort of shut down in regard because, and I think we know this, following a critical incident, it's not only about dealing with the emotional trauma. Depending upon the incident, you may have an internal investigation going on in your agency where they're looking to Monday morning quarterback you or second guess you in regard to the things that went on that day at that critical incident. So you have all of this concern in the back of your head where you're told following a critical incident often, don't talk to anybody, right? Don't speak to the job yet. Let's make sure we get you to the hospital, give you some time to think about things first. Let's take care of all the legal stuff that might be coming down the pike. And so we're automatically trained to not speak, right, to sort of clam up and to keep things inside. And so the idea of going to a mental health professional following a critical incident kind of goes against the very thing that we're often trained to do. Absolutely. Which is like, let's just tighten this up right now and let's not talk right now. Having the courage to go in to see a mental health professional following a critical incident or at any point in an officer's career is very difficult, right, because of the stigma and because of the potential career consequences that people believe come along with it, either in actuality or in fantasy.
How do you treat PTSD? And more importantly, what is the future outcome for someone that does have PTSD? Can they possibly be a viable police officer once again and do their job to the same capability and ability that they once could?
Absolutely, they can. Yes, case by case, right? Every case, you're going to see different levels of treatment effect. I'm a trauma-trained therapist as well. I'm trained in EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. And through EMDR work, we're able to try to help move the person's memory, traumatic memory, from a place stored within the brain that's purely emotional and traumatic to a place that's sort of higher order thinking so that they can still have the memory, but when they access it, not have all the painful emotions associated with it. So through EMDR therapy, it's one way of addressing traumatic response. But absolutely, cops can get back to full duty work with firearms and go on with the rest of their career, even after a traumatic event, even after getting into therapy.
Does medication help with this?
Some medications can. Ideally, I think when most agencies return people back to full duty, they prefer to see them medication-free and return back to full duty without ongoing medication. And the reason is, I have this conversation so often. It's rarely the question of what medicine a cop is on. Can this cop go back to full duty on this medication? The question is rarely the medication. The question is that once I put you back to full duty, I have no way of guaranteeing that you're going to stay compliant with that medication, right? So if the reason that your symptoms are under control is because of the medication, once I put you back to full duty, how do I know you're going to stay on that medication a year, 2 years, 10 years down the road, right? And if you decide on your own to become non-compliant with that medication, how do I know your symptoms aren't going to return, right? And so because we can't guarantee compliance with the medication, we always prefer to see somebody medication-free going back to full duty, but it's not a requisite. There are many cops, full duty, that are out there on medication, low doses of medication, and as long as they're compliant with their medication, it's fine. And yes, the medication can be very effective.
Yes, and it's a controversial topic, and I have a different view of it. And my police commissioner asks me all the time about it. And what I say is, well, if you have a cop who's struggling mentally, right? And they're out there on the street, they're working in the community, but they're not willing to get help because of the stigma and because of how they're going to be treated by the job. And if they need medication, but they're afraid to take medication because then there's no end in sight of when they will be back to full duty, I argue I would rather be working with the person who is on medication and doing the right thing for themselves, getting talk therapy. And I would rather have that person working next to me than the person who's not on medication and struggling.
I would agree with that idea. And in sort of the premise that's inherent to your point is that cop is committed to his treatment and committed to his therapy. He's not simply on the medication in order to get back to full duty, right? And so, yes, I 100% agree with you, so long as we know that that cop is going to remain compliant and stay engaged in their treatment. Absolutely.
How do we get more cops to go to treatment?
So I have long been an advocate of mandatory annual wellness visits, right? Mandating that, and it should come through legislation. It needs to be done through legislation. Certain states around the country are doing it. Maryland just recently passed it, for example. Every year annually, just like you go for your pistol qualification course, just like you go for whatever training it is, mandatory every year. Mandatory every year, I believe, every member of every department should sit down for a 30 to 45-minute wellness visit with a mental health professional. Not a therapy session, a wellness visit, right? You go to a therapist office, you sit with them for 30, 45 minutes, psychoeducational in nature, right? A conversation, sort of a face-to-face, let's do some psychoeducation in regard to mental health, let's do a check-in with you. You want to sit there with your arms crossed for 45 minutes and stare at the therapist, so be it. If that's the way you want to make use of your time, so be it. But what it does is it demystifies the experience of being in a therapist office. If you ask most people, never mind most cops, but if you ask most people, what do you think it's like being in a therapist office? What do you think it's like being in therapy? They have their own fantasy about what that might be like. And I guarantee you 90% of it is completely false, right? All it is two people sitting in a room talking to each other. That's all it is, right? And I think if we can demystify the experience of being in therapy and create the problem, for so long, law enforcement and mental health professionals have had an adversarial relationship. The relationship, for the most part, the first time a cop meets a psychologist is for their pre-employment psych, right? And what does that psychologist represent? He's an adversary. He's trying to keep me from getting my job, right? The next time a cop might meet with a mental health professional, maybe a fitness for duty evaluation. What does that mental health professional represent? They're an adversary. They're trying to take my job away from me. So the relationship between law enforcement and mental health professionals has often been perceived as being adversarial. We need to break that. Mental health professionals should not be seen as an adversary by law enforcement. They should be seen as an ally, right? And so I think that doing mandatory annual sessions starts to break that adversarial relationship.
Yes, and that's why I think you're very unique, because you are a police officer, you are a cop, and you're a doctor. And that's one of the big things that I praise my police department, Nassau County, because our employee assistance is filled with police officers who are also clinicians. And you don't see that too often. That helps break the stigma. It helps gain trust as soon as the cop walks through the door. And I think that it really is a very important thing that we have going on. And I'm very proud of my police department for having that. So let me ask you something. There's other questions out there, and I think more confusion that people, the community, the job itself, they think that just because somebody has PTSD or maybe anxiety, they think that equals the same as being suicidal. Can you please just discuss real quick the differences?
Yeah, there are so many misconceptions about mental health. There's even the misconception that people with mental health issues are at a higher propensity for violence than others. Absolutely no data that suggests that whatsoever, right? Actually, it's the opposite. You're more likely to be the victim of a violent offense by someone without no mental health condition than somebody with, right? And yes, post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety and even depression are not necessarily related to suicide. There's not necessarily a risk of suicide associated with every mental health disorder out there. There are many people out there with depression who are not suicidal. Right. So when we see suicide, we generally see three major factors, right? We see this unbearable emotional pain that someone is in and that they do not see ever ending. We see a sense of hopelessness, meaning that my situation today is really bad and today's as good as it gets. It never gets better than today. And helplessness. I'm powerless against the thing I'm up against. So we see unbearable emotional pain, hopelessness, and helplessness. Yeah, those are the three factors that when we see them, there's probably a good risk there for suicide or at least suicidal thinking. Absent those factors, just because somebody's experiencing a mental health need doesn't necessarily mean that there's a risk for suicide whatsoever.
Thank you for that. Like I said, I feel like a lot of people, it's mostly the unknown and they're uneducated, and I understand the department especially is always going to side on caution and liability. But I think that it would help a great deal if a lot of the police departments in the United States would educate themselves on the differences and not treat somebody that, might have anxiety or PTSD like they're suicidal or homicidal and they have to remove their firearms instantly, because we know what that does to a police officer when you take their firearms from them. So I really would like to put more effort out there and information out there to educate the police departments on the differences. What are the biggest changes you are seeing currently across the United States in law enforcement when it comes to mental health and wellness?
I'm seeing really positive signs out there that make me very hopeful. I'm seeing legislation passed, such as the Law Enforcement Health and Wellness Act. The FBI is now doing suicide data collection, right? So there's been a shift to gathering mandatory data regarding law enforcement mental health needs. If we can't identify the scope of the problem, then we don't know how to direct funding and resources to the problem, right? So the more and more that I see legislation like the Law Enforcement Health and Wellness Act, like the FBI Law Enforcement Suicide Data Collection Act, like the legislation down in Maryland for mandatory annual mental wellness visits, right? The more I see these legislations being passed, the more it gives me hope that we're on a positive uptick and a positive trend to really delivering the services, the culturally competent services that our members of law enforcement need and deserve.
I agree. And if you had one thing that you can have all the police departments change right now to help our cops, what would it be?
It would be to move away to stop mimicking your mental health policies with your disciplinary policies. If your policy for mental health needs in your department mimics your policies for disciplinary procedures, you are doing it 100% wrong. They should be completely divested of each other, and we should not be treating people with mental health needs or issues the same way that we treat disciplinary cases. Agreed.
My biggest message out to all of our listeners, and my message that every time I get a chance to speak, is that cops are human. And not only do we have all of this stress from the job that we're talking about, these critical incidents and trauma, we're also human, and we have financial difficulties. We have all the same difficulties that a normal person out there have, and we have the same brain as them. We're human, like I said. So it's something that we really need to start paying attention to, and we need to work on making big changes to get our police officers back to being healthy. Because like I said, if we force them into therapy, however we can do it, by breaking the stigma, and they take care of themselves, and the police departments support that, we will have healthy, happy cops on the street. And I think that's the best way to rebuild relationships with the police officers and the communities that they serve.
Having a healthier law enforcement workforce will reduce negative indicators across the board: absenteeism, excessive force incidents, et cetera. Absolutely.
Tom, how could our listeners, get in touch with you if they wanted to speak with you and use your services?
Yeah, they can find me at Blue Line Psychological Services, bluelinepsychological.com. You can also find me on Facebook or on LinkedIn under either my name, Thomas Coughlan, or Blue Line Psychological.
Thank you. And you can check this out also on Nassau County PBA Facebook and Instagram. Check us out, like us. You're listening to KJOY 98.3 with Tommy Shevlin and Police Talk. Have a great day.